Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Zebulon Rook hadn't slept in 43 hours, and Highway 95 between Beatty and Needles was starting to look like it was breathing. The white dashes in the center line pulsed in his headlights, expanding and contracting, and twice now he'd caught himself drifting into the shoulder before the rumble strips jolted him back. He rolled down the window and let the November desert air slap his face. It smelled like creosote and diesel and something else he couldn't name, something old and patient. The Mojave at night had a way of making you feel like you were the only person left alive, and Zeb had been driving these routes long enough to know that feeling was a lie. There were always people out here. The question was what kind. His rig was a 2019 Freightliner Cascadia pulling a 53-foot dry van loaded with furniture hardware bound for a distribution center in Barstow. The load was legal, the paperwork clean. His HOS logs showed he had 3 hours left on his 14-hour window. But his body was telling a different story. His eyes felt like someone had rubbed them with sandpaper, and the gas station coffee he'd bought in Tonopah had worn off 2 hours ago. The ELD was ticking away in the dash, that little digital tyrant that knew exactly how much time he had left before he'd be in violation. He needed to find a place to pull off for a 30-minute break, maybe catch a power nap, then push through to Barstow before his clock ran out. The problem was that this stretch of 95 didn't have many options. The last truck stop was 60 miles back, and the next one was another 40 ahead. There were a few informal pull-offs, places where truckers had been parking for decades, dirt patches worn smooth by thousands of tires, but Zeb had learned to be careful about those. Not all of them were safe. Some were too close to the road, others too isolated. And in recent months there'd been talk on the CB about trucks getting broken into, fuel tanks siphoned, even drivers getting hassled by people who had no business being out in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. The wind picked up as he rolled past mile marker 147, and he felt the trailer push against the tractor, that familiar sideways shove that made you grip the wheel a little tighter. The Mojave wind was no joke, especially in the fall when the temperature dropped and the air started moving in unpredictable ways. He'd seen trucks jackknife on this stretch, seen fifth wheels crack, seen tandems fold up like accordions. He eased off the throttle and brought his speed down to 55, feeling the weight of the load settle behind him. Then he saw the lights up ahead. Not headlights, not the usual traffic, but a cluster of orange and white lights off to the right side of the highway, maybe half a mile distant. At first he thought it might be a construction crew, but as he got closer he could see it was a fuel station. One of those old independent operations that still existed out here in the gaps between the major chains. The sign was dark, which meant it was closed, but there were lights on around the pumps and what looked like a couple of vehicles parked in the lot. Zeb squinted and saw the shapes more clearly now. A tow truck with its ambers flashing, and behind it a semi-trailer parked at an odd angle, nose pointed toward the building. He almost kept driving. Closed fuel stations weren't any use to him, and something about the scene felt off. The way the tow truck was positioned, the way the trailer was sitting there like it had been abandoned mid-delivery. But his body overruled his instincts. He was exhausted, his neck hurt, and his bladder was sending him urgent messages. The lot looked big enough to park in, and even if the fuel pumps were offline, he could at least take a break, use the restroom if it was open, maybe stretch his legs for 10 minutes. He put on his turn signal and eased the rig off the highway, feeling the transition from smooth asphalt to rough concrete as he rolled into the lot. The fuel station was an old Chevron that had been converted to some generic brand he didn't recognize, the kind of place that probably did most of its business during the day selling overpriced snacks and lukewarm coffee to the occasional tourist who didn't know any better. The building was small, single-story, with a flat roof and windows covered in sun-faded posters advertising beer and lottery tickets. The pumps were old, pre-digital, the kind that still had mechanical number wheels that flipped over with a satisfying click. Zeb brought the rig to a stop about 50 feet from the tow truck, set the air brake, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was disorienting. For the past 12 hours, his world had been filled with the constant rumble of the diesel, the hiss of the airlines, the rattle of the trailer behind him, and now all of that was gone, replaced by the sound of wind pushing against the side of the truck and the faint tick of the cooling engine. He sat there for a moment, letting his spine decompress, feeling the vertebrae pop as he straightened up. Through the windshield he could see the tow truck more clearly now. It was a big Peterbilt 379 with a heavy-duty wrecker bed, the kind of machine that could haul a fully loaded semi out of a ditch without breaking a sweat. The ambers were still flashing, throwing orange light across the pavement in slow, hypnotic pulses. The trailer next to it was a utility reefer, 48 feet long, and even from here Zeb could see that something was wrong with it. The nose was pointed at the building, but the rear tandems were cocked at an angle, like someone had tried to back it into a space and given up halfway through. The reefer unit was silent, which either meant the load was dead or the unit had run out of fuel. Zeb had pulled reefers before, back when he was working for a big carrier out of Kansas City, and he knew that if a refrigerated load went down, you had a narrow window to get it fixed before the product inside started to spoil. Whoever owned that trailer was probably having a very bad night. He climbed down from the cab, feeling his knees protest as his boots hit the pavement. The air was cold, maybe 40 degrees, and the wind cut through his flannel shirt like it wasn't there. He zipped up his jacket and looked around. The lot was empty except for the tow truck and the reefer trailer. No cars, no other trucks, no sign of the people who belonged to those vehicles. The building was dark except for a single light over the front door, and when Zeb walked over to check, he found the door locked. A handwritten sign taped to the glass said closed, and below that, in smaller letters, back at 6 a.m. He checked his watch. It was 3:17 in the morning. Almost 3 hours until the place opened. He walked around the side of the building looking for a restroom, but all he found was a dumpster and a locked utility door. No bathroom, no vending machines, nothing. He was about to give up and just relieve himself behind the dumpster when he heard voices. They were coming from the other side of the lot, near the tow truck. 2 men talking in low tones. Zeb couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. One voice asking questions, the other responding with short, clipped answers. He walked back around the building and saw them now, 2 figures standing near the rear of the reefer trailer. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a high-visibility vest over a denim jacket. The other was shorter, thinner, dressed in dark clothes that made him hard to see in the dim light. Zeb hesitated. He didn't want to get involved in whatever was going on here, but at the same time, he was curious. Tow truck operators didn't usually work this late unless it was an emergency, and the way these 2 were standing, close together, heads bent in conversation, suggested something more than a routine breakdown. He decided to approach, keeping his hands visible, trying to look casual and non-threatening. The tall man saw him first and turned, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. Up close, Zeb could see that the high-vis vest had a logo on it, Vickery Recovery Services. The man was in his late 40s with a thick gray beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and trusted too little. He studied Zeb for a moment, then nodded. "Help you with something?" His voice was rough, the kind that came from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. "Just pulled off to take a break," Zeb said. "Saw your lights, thought the station might be open." "Closed," the man said. "Won't open till 6. "Yeah, I saw the sign. You guys broke down?" The man glanced at the shorter figure, who had turned away and was now walking toward the front of the reefer trailer, hands in his pockets. "Not exactly," the tall man said. "Owner called me out to haul this thing back to Vegas. Reefer units shot, loads compromised. He's trying to figure out if it's worth fixing or if he should just cut his losses." Zeb nodded. That made sense. A reefer load going bad was expensive, and if the trailer itself had mechanical issues, sometimes it was cheaper to write the whole thing off and file an insurance claim. "Rough night for him," he said. "Rough night for everybody," the man said. He extended a hand. "Merit Vickery." Zeb shook it. The grip was firm, calloused. "Zebulon Rook. People call me Zeb." "You hauling?" Merritt asked, nodding toward Zeb's Freightliner. "Dry van, furniture hardware, heading to Barstow." "Long haul from where?" "Reno." Merritt grunted. "You're cutting it close on your hours, I bet." Zeb didn't like how accurate that was. "I've got time," he said, a little defensively. "Sure you do." Merritt's tone wasn't mocking, just matter of fact. He turned and called out to the other man. "Hey, this guy's just taking a break. He's good." The other man didn't respond. He was standing near the front of the reefer now, examining something on the ground. Zeb couldn't see what it was from this angle, but the way the man was crouched down, running his fingers over the pavement, made him uneasy. "Your partner always this quiet?" Zeb asked. Merritt's expression shifted, just a flicker of something Zeb couldn't read. "He's not my partner," Merritt said. "He's the shipper's rep. Came out here to assess the damage." "At 3 in the morning?" "Like I said, rough night for everybody." Zeb was about to ask another question when the other man stood up and walked back toward them. Up close, Zeb could see he was younger than he'd first appeared, maybe early 30s, with a narrow face and dark eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything in particular. He was wearing black jeans and a black windbreaker, and there was something about the way he moved, smooth and deliberate, that made Zeb think of a cat stalking a bird. "We got a problem," the man said to Merritt. His voice was flat, emotionless. "What kind of problem?" Merritt asked. The man glanced at Zeb, then back at Merritt. "The kind we need to talk about in private." Merritt's jaw tightened. He looked at Zeb and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Listen, buddy, I appreciate you stopping by, but we've got some business to handle here. You should probably get back on the road." Zeb felt a prickle of warning run down his spine. Something was wrong. He'd been around long enough to recognize when a situation was turning bad, and this one had all the signs. The too polite dismissal, the tension in Merritt's shoulders, the way the other man was staring at him like he was calculating something. Zeb took a step back, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "No problem," he said. "I'll be out of your way." He turned and walked back toward his truck, trying not to hurry, trying to look casual. Behind him, he heard the two men talking in low voices, but he couldn't make out the words. He reached the Freightliner and climbed up into the cab, his heart pounding harder than it should have been. He sat in the driver's seat and looked out at the lot. Merritt and the other man were still standing near the reefer, but now they were both looking in his direction. Zeb started the engine. The diesel rumbled to life, and he felt a little better with the power of the machine around him. He was about to release the air brake when he saw movement in his side mirror. The other man, the one in the black windbreaker, was walking toward the Freightliner. Not running, not rushing, just walking with that same smooth, deliberate pace. Zeb's hand moved to the door lock, flipping it down with a solid thunk. The man reached the driver's side door and looked up at Zeb through the window. Up close, his face was even more unsettling, all sharp angles and cold eyes. He made a rolling motion with his hand, the universal signal for roll down your window. Zeb shook his head. The man's expression didn't change. He reached into his windbreaker and pulled out a phone, holding it up so Zeb could see the screen. There was a photo on it, but from this angle and in the dim light, Zeb couldn't make out what it showed. The man tapped on the window with his knuckles, not hard, just a gentle rap, rap, rap. Then he spoke, his voice muffled by the glass. "You need to see this." Zeb shook his head again. "I'm good," he called out, loud enough to be heard through the door. The man's expression still didn't change. He tapped on the window again, harder this time. "It's about your truck," he said. That got Zeb's attention. He hesitated, then cracked the window open about 2 inches, just enough to hear clearly, but not enough for anyone to reach through. "What about my truck?" The man held up the phone again, angling it so Zeb could see the screen. The photo showed a white Freightliner Cascadia with a dry van trailer, parked at what looked like a way station. The angle was from above, probably from a security camera. Zeb's breath caught. It was his truck. He recognized the dent in the trailer door, the company logo on the side, even the mud flaps with the chrome Yosemite Sam silhouette. "Where did you get that?" Zeb asked. "Doesn't matter," the man said. "What matters is that this truck came through the Prim Way station yesterday afternoon, and the scale ticket doesn't match the bill of lading. Weight's off by about 2,000 pounds. Zeb felt his stomach drop. A weight discrepancy wasn't necessarily a big deal if you could explain it. Fuel burn, pallets shifting, a data entry error. But it could also be a red flag for DOT enforcement, especially if they thought you were running overweight or hauling undeclared cargo. "That's impossible," he said. "I got weighed in Reno. Everything was clean." "Maybe it was clean in Reno," the man said. "But it's not clean now." He lowered the phone and looked up at Zeb with those cold, expressionless eyes. "Here's how this works. You've got a problem, and I can make it go away. But it's going to cost you." "Cost me what?" $3,000, cash. Zeb almost laughed. It was so absurd, so blatantly a shakedown, that for a moment he couldn't quite believe it was happening. "You're out of your mind," he said. The man shrugged. "Maybe. But in about 6 hours, when that way station opens back up, they're going to pull your records and see that discrepancy. And then they're going to put out a notice. And then every scale between here and Barstow is going to be looking for you. And when they find you, they're going to tear your truck apart looking for whatever you're hauling that's not on the manifest. Could take hours, could take days, and the whole time, your clock is ticking." Zeb's mind was racing. This didn't make sense. Way stations didn't work like that. If there was a discrepancy, they'd flag it immediately, not wait until the next shift. And even if they did, they wouldn't put out some kind of APB for a minor weight issue. This was a scam. Had to be. But the photo was real. That was definitely his truck. And if this guy had access to way station records, even fake ones, he could cause real problems. "I don't have $3,000, Zeb said. "Then you better find it," the man said. "Because if you don't, I'm going to make a call, and by sunrise you're going to be sitting at a scale house with a level 1 inspection crew going through your entire rig with a fine-tooth comb. And even if they don't find anything, you're going to lose a full day. Maybe more. You're going to blow your delivery window. You're going to have to explain to your dispatcher why you're late. And all of that is going to cost you a lot more than $3,000. Zeb felt a hot surge of anger. He wanted to tell this guy to go to hell, wanted to put the truck in gear and drive away, but he couldn't shake the fear that there was some truth to what he was saying. What if there really was a discrepancy? What if someone had tampered with his load in Reno, slipped something extra into the trailer without him knowing? It happens sometimes. Cargo theft rings. Smugglers using legitimate trucks as mules. He thought about the weight ticket he'd gotten in Reno, tried to remember the exact numbers, but he'd been so tired when he rolled across the scale that he'd barely glanced at it. "I need to see that photo again," Zeb said. The man held up the phone. Zeb squinted at the screen, trying to read the details. The timestamp on the image said 1647 yesterday, November 3rd. The location tag said Prim Scale, NBI 15. But Zeb hadn't gone through Prim. His route from Reno to Barstow took him down US 95, not I-15. He'd never been anywhere near Prim. "That's not my truck," Zeb said, the realization hitting him like cold water. "I didn't go through Prim." The man's expression flickered just for a second, and Zeb saw something there. Annoyance, maybe, or frustration. "You sure about that?" the man said. "Positive. I came down 95. Check the ELD logs if you don't believe me." The man stared at him for a long moment, and Zeb could see the gears turning behind those cold eyes. Finally, the man lowered the phone and stepped back from the truck. "My mistake," he said, his tone utterly flat. "Must have been a different Freightliner." Zeb didn't say anything. He just watched as the man turned and walked back toward the Merritt, who was still standing near the tow truck. The two of them had a brief conversation, too quiet for Zeb to hear, and then Merritt climbed into the cab of the Peterbilt and started the engine. The ambers stopped flashing, and the diesel rumble filled the lot. The man in the windbreaker walked around to the passenger side and got in. Zeb sat there, engine idling, watching as the tow truck pulled out of the lot and headed north on 95, taillights shrinking into the distance. He waited until they were completely out of sight before he finally released the breath he'd been holding. His hands were shaking. He gripped the steering wheel and tried to steady himself, tried to process what had just happened. It was a scam, had to be. They'd targeted him because he looked tired, because he'd pulled into an isolated fuel station in the middle of the night, because he fit the profile of someone who might panic and pay up rather than deal with the hassle. The photo was probably real, probably some other Freightliner they'd pulled from a way station database, but it had nothing to do with him. They'd been counting on him not checking the details, not thinking clearly, just handing over the cash out of fear. But what if it wasn't a scam? What if there really was something wrong with his load, something he didn't know about? Zeb climbed down from the cab and walked back to the trailer. He pulled out his flashlight and inspected the doors. The seals were intact, the lock was in place, everything looked normal. He walked around to the side and shone the light along the bottom edge, looking for signs of tampering, scratches on the hinges, pry marks on the panels, anything that might suggest someone had gotten into the trailer. Nothing. He went back to the cab and pulled out his paperwork. The bill of lading said he was hauling 12,000 pounds of furniture hardware, assorted brackets and fasteners and drawer slides packed in cardboard boxes on 42 pallets. The weight ticket from Reno said his gross vehicle weight was 62,000 pounds, which matched the BOL plus the weight of the truck and trailer. Everything was clean. No discrepancies. Zeb sat in the driver's seat and looked out at the empty lot. The fuel station was dark, the wind was still blowing, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint howl of a coyote. He thought about calling his dispatcher, telling him what had happened. But what would he say? That some random guy tried to shake him down with a fake photo? That he'd almost fallen for it? It would make him look gullible, careless. Better to just forget it and move on. He checked his ELD. He'd burned through 20 minutes of his break, which left him with 2 hours and 40 minutes on his drive clock. Enough to make it to Barstow if he didn't hit any delays. He released the air brake and put the truck in gear, feeling the weight of the trailer settle behind him as he rolled forward. He navigated out of the lot and back onto Highway 95, heading south, the road stretching out ahead of him like a black ribbon. For the next hour, he drove in silence. No radio, no CB, just the sound of the engine and the wind. He kept thinking about the man in the windbreaker, the cold eyes, the flat voice, the way he'd known exactly what to say to make Zeb doubt himself, to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something wrong. It was a kind of psychological warfare, Zeb realized, exploiting fear and exhaustion and the low-level paranoia that every trucker carried with them, the knowledge that one mistake, one missed detail, could cost you your job, your CDL, your livelihood. He thought about Merritt Vickery, too. The tow truck operator had seemed legitimate, professional, but he'd been part of it. Had to have been. The whole setup, the closed fuel station, the reefer trailer with the compromised load. It had all been theater, a stage designed to make Zeb believe the story. And it had almost worked. The sun was starting to come up as Zeb crossed into California, the sky turning from black to deep blue to pale orange. He rolled through the agricultural inspection station at Yermo without incident, then continued west on I-15 toward Barstow. The warehouse was on the east side of town, a big industrial complex with a guard shack and a dozen loading docks. Zeb backed the trailer into Dock 7 and climbed down, feeling the stiffness in his legs as he walked to the office to check in. The shipping clerk was a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She took his paperwork, glanced at the BOL, and typed something into her computer. Then she frowned. "You got a scale ticket from last night?" she asked. Zeb felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "Says here you came through the Prim way station around 5 p.m. yesterday. There's a notation on your file." "I didn't go through Prim," Zeb said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I came down 95. The clerk looked at him over her glasses. "Well, somebody with your truck number did. You want to see?" She turned the monitor so he could see the screen. There it was, the same photo the man had shown him. His truck, his trailer, timestamp 1647, location Prim scale. But the truck number was different. Not his unit number, but close, off by 2 digits. Someone had doctored the image, swapped the numbers, made it look like his truck when it wasn't. "That's not my truck," Zeb said, pointing at the screen. "Look at the unit number. That's not me." The clerk squinted at the screen, then back at Zeb's paperwork. "Huh, you're right. Somebody screwed up the data entry." She made a note in the computer. "I'll get this fixed. You're good to go." Zeb walked back to his truck on shaky legs. He sat in the cab and stared at his hands. They were still trembling. He thought about what could have happened if he'd paid that $3,000, if he'd let them scare him into making a mistake. He thought about how many other drivers they'd run this scam on, how many had paid up out of fear, how much money they'd made. And then he thought about the way station. If they'd gotten into the database, even just to pull a photo, what else could they access? What other information did they have? He pulled out his phone and called the California Highway Patrol non-emergency line. When the dispatcher answered, Zeb told her everything. The closed fuel station, the tow truck, the man with the photo, the attempted extortion. The dispatcher took notes and told him someone would follow up. Zeb never heard back. He checked with the dispatcher a week later, but there was no record of any investigation, no arrests, nothing. The fuel station on Highway 95 was still there, still closed at night, still sitting empty under the desert stars. And somewhere out there, Merritt Vickery and his partner were still working, still running their scam on tired drivers who just wanted to make it home. Zeb still drives that route sometimes, Reno to Barstow, down through the Mojave on Highway 95. And every time he passes that fuel station, he slows down and looks. The lights are always on, the lot is always empty, and sometimes, late at night, he can see the orange flash of ambers in the distance, a tow truck waiting for the next mark. He never stops there anymore. He drives past, hands tight on the wheel, eyes on the road, and he doesn't look back. But sometimes when the wind is blowing hard and the desert is dark, and he's alone in his cab with nothing but the sound of the engine, he wonders how many drivers didn't figure it out in time. How many paid? How many are still out there, driving with that weight on their shoulders, wondering if the next way station will be the one where it all falls apart? And he wonders if, somewhere in a database he'll never see, his name is still there, flagged, waiting. The thermometer on Weldon Pike's dashboard read 106 degrees, and that was at 9:30 in the morning. By noon, it would be pushing 115, the kind of heat that made the asphalt soft and turned the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe it. Weldon had been running I-10 through southern Arizona for 6 years, and he still wasn't used to the Sonoran in August. The heat was one thing, you could deal with heat, but it was the way the desert stretched out on both sides of the highway, endless and flat and hostile, that got to him. Miles and miles of nothing except saguaro cactus and creosote bushes, and dirt the color of dried blood. He was pulling a 48-foot reefer trailer loaded with produce, tomatoes and peppers and lettuce coming out of Yuma and heading to a distribution center in Tucson. The reefer unit was humming along at 34 degrees, and every time Weldon checked his mirrors, he could see the refrigeration coils venting white vapor into the superheated air. The trailer was running fine. No alarms, no temperature fluctuations, and the load was worth about $60,000 if it arrived fresh. If the reefer failed, if the temperature spiked, he'd be looking at a total loss and a mountain of paperwork that would haunt him for months. The CB radio crackled with static and distant voices, truckers calling out speed traps and accidents and weather conditions, but Weldon kept his mic clipped to the sun visor and didn't say much. He preferred to drive in silence, letting his mind wander, thinking about nothing in particular. He'd left Yuma at 6 a.m. and had already cleared the egg inspection at Welton, and if traffic stayed light, he'd be in Tucson by 1 p.m., plenty of time to make his delivery window and get unloaded before the warehouse closed for the day. Then, about 10 miles past Gila Bend, he heard it. A sound coming from the trailer, muffled but distinct. A rhythmic thumping that didn't match the normal vibration of the road. At first he thought it was just the pallets shifting. Produce loads did that sometimes, the weight settling as you drove, but this was different. This was deliberate. Thump, pause, thump, thump, pause, like someone knocking. Weldon's first thought was that he'd imagined it. Heat exhaustion could do strange things to your head, make you hear things that weren't there, see mirages on the horizon that looked like water or mountains or cities. He turned down the radio and listened. There it was again. Thump, thump, thump. Coming from somewhere behind him, somewhere in the trailer. He felt a cold spike of fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd heard stories, every trucker had, about people hiding in trailers, stowaways looking for a free ride across the border or across the state. Sometimes they were just migrants trying to reach family, desperate and harmless. But other times they were something worse, criminals, smugglers, people with reasons to stay hidden. A few years back, a driver in Texas had opened his trailer at a rest stop and found 3 men inside, one of them armed, and the driver had ended up in the hospital with a fractured skull. Weldon checked his mirrors, scanning the road behind him. Nothing but empty highway and heat shimmer. He was alone out here. The nearest town was miles behind him, the nearest exit even farther ahead. He could pull over and check the trailer, but the thought of opening those doors in this heat, not knowing what he'd find inside, made his stomach clench. Better to keep driving, get to the next rest area, maybe call the highway patrol and have them check it out. The thumping stopped. Weldon waited, listening, but all he could hear was the rumble of the diesel and the hum of the reefer unit. Maybe it had been the pallets after all. Maybe he'd overreacted. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and tried to relax his grip on the wheel. 5 minutes later, it started again. Thump, thump, thump. Faster this time, more urgent. And then, faintly, he heard something else. A voice. He couldn't make out words. It was too muffled, too distorted by the layers of metal and insulation between him and the trailer, but it was definitely a voice. Someone was in there. Weldon's mouth went dry. He fumbled for the CB mic and keyed it. "This is Weldon Pike, westbound I-10 at mile marker 1 and 12. I've got a situation here. Anybody out there, please respond." Static hissed back at him. He tried again, adjusting the squelch, flipping through channels, but the airwaves were dead. No truckers, no chatter, just the empty crackle of distance. He dropped the mic and grabbed his cell phone from the cup holder. No signal. Out here in the deep desert, between the mountain ranges, cell coverage was spotty at best. The thumping grew louder. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was pounding, like someone was hitting the inside of the trailer with their fists, or maybe kicking the walls. Weldon's heart was racing now. He scanned the road ahead, looking for an exit, a rest area, any place he could pull off safely, but there was nothing. The next rest area was painted rock, still 8 miles away. He pushed the accelerator down and watched his speed climb to 70, then 75. The trailer swayed behind him, the weight of the load pulling against the fifth wheel, and the reefer unit whined as it worked harder to keep the temperature stable. The pounding continued, relentless now, and Weldon thought he could hear yelling, someone screaming, but the sound was so faint and distorted that he couldn't be sure. Painted rock rest area appeared on the horizon, a cluster of brown buildings and ramadas set back from the highway. Weldon hit his turn signal and eased the rig off the interstate, rolling into the parking lot at 20 miles an hour. The rest area was nearly empty, just a couple of cars and a white pickup truck parked near the restrooms. Weldon brought the truck to a stop at the far end of the lot, away from the other vehicles, and set the air brake. He killed the engine and sat there, listening. The pounding had stopped. The trailer was silent except for the hum of the reefer unit. Weldon climbed down from the cab, his legs shaky, and walked around to the back of the trailer. The doors were sealed with a steel bar and a padlock, standard setup for a refrigerated load. He put his hand on the door and felt the cold metal vibrating slightly from the reefer compressor. He pressed his ear against it and listened. Nothing. "Hey!" he called out, his voice sounding thin and strained. "Anybody in there?" No response. Weldon stepped back and looked at the doors. The seal was intact, the padlock was secure. If someone was inside, they'd gotten in before the trailer was locked in Yuma, which meant they'd been in there for at least 4 hours, breathing refrigerated air, surrounded by pallets of produce. The reefer was set to 34 degrees. Cold enough to keep vegetables fresh, but cold enough to kill a person. He didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. He pulled out his phone. Still no signal. He looked around the rest area, hoping to see someone. A maintenance worker, a park ranger, anyone official, but the place seemed deserted. The only person he could see was a figure standing near the ramada, partially hidden in shadow. Weldon squinted against the glare and saw that it was a woman, older, maybe in her 60s, wearing a faded blue shirt and khaki pants. She was holding a broom and dustpan, and she was watching him. Weldon walked over to her, trying to look calm, trying not to run. Up close, he could see that she was a rest area custodian. Her shirt had a name tag that said Eulalie Marchbanks. Her face was weathered and creased, the kind of face that came from spending decades in the sun, and her eyes were sharp and wary. "You all right, honey?" she asked, her voice scratchy like sandpaper on wood. "I need help," Weldon said. "I think there's someone in my trailer." Eulalie's expression didn't change. She looked past him at the rig, then back at his face. "You think or you know?" "I heard pounding and voices. Someone's in there." Eulalie set down the broom and wiped her hands on her pants. "You open it up and check?" "Not yet. It's a sealed reefer load. I opened those doors without authorization. I could lose my job." "You could also have a dead person in there," Eulalie said, her tone flat and matter-of-fact. "Heat like this, even with the refrigeration, somebody gets locked in a trailer. They don't last long." Weldon felt his stomach turn. "I need to call the police. You have a phone?" "Office phone's been out for 2 days. Budget cuts." Eulalie pulled a cell phone out of her pocket and checked the screen. "I've got one bar. Might work, might not." She dialed 911 and held the phone to her ear, waiting. Weldon watched her face, trying to read her expression, but she gave nothing away. After a moment, she lowered the phone and shook her head. "Call dropped. Coverage out here is garbage." "What do I do?" Weldon asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. Eulalie looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're the driver. It's your truck. But if it were me, I'd open those doors and see what's what. Better to explain to your boss why you broke a seal than explain to a judge why you let someone die." Weldon walked back to the trailer, Eulalie following a few steps behind. He pulled out his key ring and found the key to the padlock. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the key into the lock. The padlock clicked open and he pulled it free, then lifted the steel bar and set it aside. He grabbed the handle on the right door and took a deep breath. "You ready?" Eulalie asked. Weldon nodded. He pulled the handle and swung the door open. Cold air rushed out, a wave of refrigerated fog that smelled like fresh vegetables and something else, something sour and organic. Weldon stepped back, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior of the trailer. Pallets were stacked 3 high, wrapped in plastic shrink wrap, filling the space from floor to ceiling. He couldn't see past the first row, couldn't see if there was anyone inside. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed in the metal chamber. "Anybody in there?" Silence. Weldon climbed up into the trailer, feeling the cold bite into his skin after hours in the desert heat. He walked between the pallets, scanning left and right, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was hiding in here. Nothing. He reached the front of the trailer, the nose where the reefer unit was mounted, and found nothing but more pallets. No people, no stowaways, nothing. He walked back to the doors and climbed down, shaking his head at Eulalie. "There's nobody in there." Eulalie frowned. "You sure?" "I checked every inch. It's just produce." "Then what were you hearing?" "I don't know." Weldon felt a mix of relief and confusion. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe the heat and the stress and the long hours had gotten to him, made him hear things that weren't real, but it had seemed so vivid, so real. The pounding, the voices. Eulalie walked up to the trailer and peered inside, her eyes scanning the stacks of pallets. "You check behind all these boxes?" "I walked the whole length. There's no room for someone to hide." Eulalie reached up and rapped her knuckles against one of the pallets. The sound echoed through the trailer, a hollow metallic thump. She did it again, 3 times in quick succession. Thump, thump, thump. Weldon's blood went cold. It was the same sound he'd heard on the highway. "Pallets shifting," Eulalie said. "Happens all the time with produce loads. Weight settles, boxes slide around, sounds like someone knocking. Add in the road vibration and your imagination, and you've got yourself a ghost. Weldon felt his face flush with embarrassment. I could have sworn I heard voices. Whined through the reefer vents, Eulalie said. Makes all kinds of noise. I've been working rest areas for 20 years, honey. I've heard it all. Weldon nodded, trying to convince himself that she was right. It made sense. Pallets shifting. Wind noise. His tired brain filling in the gaps. He closed the trailer doors and secured them, snapping the padlock back into place. Thanks for your help, he said. Eulalie shrugged. No problem. You take care of yourself out there. And maybe get some rest before you drive any farther. You look like you're about to fall over. Weldon promised he would. Then climbed back into the cab and started the engine. He pulled out of the rest area and merged back onto I-10, heading west toward Tucson. The reefer unit hummed behind him, steady and reliable. And the trailer was silent. No pounding, no voices, just the normal vibration of the road. He tried to relax, tried to focus on the highway ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Eulalie's explanation made sense, but it didn't explain everything. The pounding had been too rhythmic, too deliberate. And the voices, he'd heard voices. He was sure of it. Unless he was losing his mind. An hour later, he rolled into the distribution center in Tucson and backed the trailer into the receiving dock. The warehouse crew opened the doors and started unloading the pallets, using forklifts to move the produce into the refrigerated storage area. Weldon stood nearby, filling out paperwork, half watching the workers as they moved boxes. Everything seemed normal. The load was intact. The temperature had held steady. The produce was fresh. Then one of the forklift operators called out, "Hey, we got a problem here." Weldon walked over. The operator was pointing at one of the pallets near the front of the trailer, the one closest to the reefer unit. The shrink wrap had been torn open, and several boxes of lettuce had been pulled off the stack and opened. The lettuce inside was wilted and brown, ruined. "This wasn't like this when we loaded it," the operator said. "Looks like someone went through it." Weldon felt his stomach twist. He climbed into the trailer and examined the damaged pallet. The boxes had been opened carefully, not ripped or crushed, but opened as if someone had been looking for something. He checked the other pallets nearby and found 2 more that had been tampered with. Shrink wrap torn. Boxes opened and resealed. "Get your supervisor," Weldon said, his voice tight. The warehouse supervisor was a short, heavy-set man named Garcia, who looked annoyed at being called away from his office. He climbed into the trailer and inspected the damaged pallets, making notes on a clipboard. "This is going to be a rejected load," he said. "We can't accept product that's been compromised." "Compromised how?" Weldon asked. "It's just some damaged boxes." "Compromised as in someone opened them," Garcia said. "Could be contamination, could be tampering. We don't know. Policy is to reject the entire load and send it back to the shipper." Weldon felt panic rising in his chest. A rejected load meant no payment. An angry customer, possible termination. "I checked this trailer 4 hours ago. There was nobody inside." "Well, somebody was inside at some point," Garcia said. "These boxes didn't open themselves." Weldon pulled out his phone and called his dispatcher, explaining the situation. The dispatcher told him to sit tight while he contacted the shipper in Yuma. Weldon waited in the warehouse office, drinking stale coffee and watching the clock. An hour later, the dispatcher called back with bad news. The shipper was claiming that the load had been intact when it left Yuma, which meant the damage had occurred in transit, which meant Weldon was responsible. "I didn't touch those boxes," Weldon said. "I swear." "Doesn't matter," the dispatcher said. You signed for the load. It's your responsibility. We're filing an insurance claim, but until it's resolved, you're off the roster." Weldon's hands were shaking as he ended the call. He walked out of the warehouse and stood in the parking lot, staring at his truck. The reefer unit was still running, still venting white vapor into the afternoon heat. He thought about the pounding he'd heard, the voices, the way the pallets had seemed normal when he checked at Painted Rock. Someone had been in that trailer, he was sure of it now, but how? When? He called the highway patrol and filed a report explaining everything. The sounds, the rest area, the damaged boxes. The trooper who took the call was sympathetic but skeptical. "So you're saying someone broke into your sealed trailer while you were driving, opened some boxes of lettuce, then disappeared without a trace?" "I know how it sounds," Weldon said. "I'll make a note of it," the trooper said. "But unless you've got evidence, photos, witnesses, there's not much we can do." Weldon hung up and sat in the cab of his truck, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He pulled up the security footage from the rest area on his phone, hoping that maybe one of the cameras had caught something. But the website showed that Painted Rock didn't have security cameras. Budget cuts. He thought about Eulalie Marchbanks, the custodian with the sharp eyes and the flat voice. She'd been so quick to dismiss what he'd heard, so ready with an explanation. Too quick, maybe. He tried to remember details, the way she'd stood in the shadow of the Ramada, the way she'd wrapped her knuckles on the pallet, the way she'd been watching him before he even approached. Weldon pulled out of the distribution center and drove back east on I-10, retracing his route. He exited at Painted Rock and rolled into the rest area, scanning for Eulalie's white pickup truck. It wasn't there. He parked and walked to the Ramada where he'd seen her earlier. The broom and dustpan were gone. He tried the office door, locked. A family with 2 kids was using the picnic tables, and Weldon walked over and asked if they'd seen the custodian. The father shook his head. "Place seems pretty empty. We've been here for 20 minutes, haven't seen anybody." Weldon walked back to his truck, his mind racing. He pulled out his phone and searched for Eulalie Marchbanks, Arizona Rest Area Custodian. No results. He tried Painted Rock Rest Area staff. Nothing. He called the Arizona Department of Transportation and asked to speak to someone about rest area employees. After being transferred 3 times, he reached a woman in HR who told him that Painted Rock Rest Area was currently operating with minimal staff due to budget constraints, and that they didn't have a custodian named Eulalie Marchbanks on their roster. In fact, they didn't have any custodians assigned to that location at all. Weldon sat in the parking lot as the sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the sky orange and purple. He thought about the woman with the weathered face and the sharp eyes, the way she'd known exactly what to say to make him doubt himself, to make him open the trailer doors and walk away. He thought about the damaged pallets, the way the boxes had been opened so carefully, as if someone had been looking for something or planting something. He never found out what happened. The insurance claim was denied, the shipper refused to pay, and Weldon was suspended from driving for 6 months pending an investigation that went nowhere. He heard rumors later, stories from other drivers about loads being tampered with on I-10, about people posing as rest area workers, about trucks being targeted in ways that seemed random but weren't. But nobody could prove anything. Weldon eventually got his job back, but he never pulled another reefer load through Arizona. He stuck to dry vans, sealed trailers with nothing inside that anyone would want, and whenever he drove past Painted Rock Rest Area, he kept his eyes on the road and didn't stop, not even for a bathroom break, because somewhere in the back of his mind he could still hear it. The pounding, the voices, the sound of something moving in the dark, cold space behind him, something that was there and then wasn't, something that knew exactly how to make him doubt what he'd heard. Abner Lathrop had been driving trucks for 19 years, and in all that time he'd learned one fundamental truth about the Chihuahuan Desert. It wanted you dead, and it had all the time in the world to make it happen. The wind was the worst part. Not the heat, which could hit 120 in July, or the isolation, which could stretch 100 miles between gas stations, but the wind. It came off the flats like something alive, something with teeth, and it didn't just push against your truck, it tried to shove you off the road, tried to flip your trailer, tried to make you understand how small you were and how big it was. Tonight, the wind was howling across US 62 between Carlsbad and El Paso, strong enough that Abner could feel his Kenworth T680 shuddering with each gust. He was pulling a 40-foot flatbed loaded with drilling equipment, pipe sections, and drill bits and hydraulic tools bound for an oil field outside Van Horn. The load was chained down tight. He'd checked it twice before leaving Carlsbad, but the wind didn't care about chains. It found gaps, it tested edges, it looked for weakness. The clock on his dash read 11:47 p.m. Abner had been on the road for 9 hours and had another 3 to go before he could shut down for his mandatory 10-hour break. His logs were clean, his paperwork was in order, and barring any major delays he'd be in Van Horn by 3 a.m., which would put him ahead of schedule. He liked being ahead of schedule. It gave him buffer time, room to deal with the unexpected. The CB crackled with static and a faint voice, someone talking about road conditions near Del City, but the signal was weak and broken. Abner turned down the volume and focused on the road. US 62 was a 2-lane highway that cut through the heart of the Chihuahuan, passing through towns that barely qualified as towns. Places with names like Salt Flat and Pine Springs and Cornudas. There was almost no traffic this time of night, just the occasional set of headlights coming from the opposite direction, and long stretches of darkness between. Then he saw the lights behind him. Abner checked his mirrors and saw a vehicle maybe half a mile back. Headlights bright and steady. At first he thought it was another truck, but as it got closer he realized it was smaller, probably a pickup or SUV. It was moving fast, gaining on him, and within a minute it was right on his bumper, close enough that Abner could see the outline of a light bar mounted on the roof. Law enforcement, Abner thought. Border Patrol, maybe, or DPS. This close to the border you saw them all the time, cruising the highways, watching for suspicious vehicles, checking trucks for hidden compartments or undeclared cargo. Abner kept his speed steady at 65 and waited for the vehicle to pass or pull him over. It did neither. It just stayed there, riding his bumper, close enough that Abner could count the individual LED lights on the bar. After a few minutes, the vehicle pulled out into the left lane and came up alongside him. Abner glanced over and saw a white Ford F-250 with tinted windows and a full light bar across the roof. The lights weren't flashing, which was unusual for an enforcement vehicle, but the truck had that official look, clean and well-maintained, with what looked like government plates. The driver's window was down, and Abner could see a figure inside, just a silhouette against the darkness, wearing what might have been a uniform, or maybe just a dark shirt. The figure raised a hand and made a gesture, pointing forward, then tapping the air twice. Abner frowned. He wasn't sure what that meant. "Follow me? Speed up?" He looked ahead and didn't see anything. No accident, no construction, nothing that would require him to alter his route. The Ford accelerated and pulled ahead, its taillights bright red in the desert night, then merged back into the right lane about 100 yards in front of Abner's truck. Abner eased off the throttle, letting the distance between them increase. He didn't like this. Something felt wrong. Official vehicles didn't play games like this. They pulled you over and ran your credentials and either waved you on or wrote you a ticket. They didn't drive alongside you making cryptic hand gestures and then speed off. He thought about calling it in on the CB, asking if anyone else had seen a white Ford with a light bar on 62, but the airwaves were dead quiet. The Ford's brake lights flashed once, twice, and then it slowed down, forcing Abner to slow down as well. His speed dropped to 50, then 45. The Ford was pacing him now, staying just ahead, matching his speed exactly. Abner felt a prickle of unease. He could pass, the left lane was open, but something told him not to. Something told him to hold back, watch, wait. They drove like that for 5 miles, the Ford leading, Abner following, the wind battering both vehicles. Then the Ford's turn signal came on, right blinker flashing, and it started to slow down even more. Abner saw a dirt road coming up on the right, barely visible in the darkness. Just a gap in the desert with a faded sign that said private road, no trespassing. The Ford turned onto the dirt road and stopped, its headlights pointing into the desert. Light bar still on, but not flashing. Abner kept driving. Whatever this was, he wanted no part of it. He passed the dirt road and watched in his mirror as the Ford sat there, motionless, just a collection of lights in the middle of nowhere. Then the Ford's engine roared, and it lurched back onto the highway, tires spitting gravel, and came after him. It closed the distance in seconds and pulled up alongside him again, matching his speed. This time the driver's window went down all the way, and the figure inside leaned out, waving frantically, gesturing for Abner to pull over. Abner's heart was pounding now. This wasn't law enforcement. This was something else. He reached for his CB mic and keyed it. "This is Abner Lathrop, eastbound 62 at mile marker 78. I've got a white Ford F-250 harassing me, trying to get me to pull off the highway. Anybody out there, please respond." No answer, just static. The Ford pulled ahead again, and this time it swerved into Abner's lane, brake lights flashing, forcing him to slow down. Abner hit his own brakes, feeling the load shift behind him, the chains creaking with the sudden deceleration. The Ford slowed to a crawl, 30 miles an hour, then 20. Abner had no choice but to follow, his speed dropping, the wind pushing against the side of the trailer. Then the Ford's hazard lights came on, and it pulled onto the shoulder, coming to a complete stop. Abner passed it, keeping his eyes forward, trying to ignore the vehicle in his mirrors. But as he pulled away, he saw the Ford's doors open and 2 figures step out. They were wearing dark clothes, and one of them had something in his hands, something that caught the light from the truck's cab. A flashlight, maybe, or something else. Abner accelerated, pushing his speed back up to 65, trying to put distance between himself and whatever was happening back there. He checked his mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see the Ford's headlights coming after him, but the road behind him stayed dark. The Ford didn't follow, it just sat there on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, the 2 figures standing beside it. For the next 10 miles, Abner drove in a state of heightened alert, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead and the mirrors behind. He passed through Salt Flat without seeing another vehicle, past the turn for Guadalupe Mountains National Park, past the Border Patrol checkpoint at Pine Springs. The checkpoint was closed for the night, the gates pulled across the road, the inspection lanes empty. Abner had been through this checkpoint dozens of times and had never seen it closed. There was always someone on duty, always agents checking vehicles, always lights and activity. But tonight it was dark and abandoned. He kept driving. Van Horn was still 50 miles away, and Abner was starting to wonder if he should just pull off at the next town and wait until daylight. But there were no towns between here and Van Horn, just empty highway and desert. He thought about calling his dispatcher, but what would he say? That a white Ford had tried to get him to pull over? That the Border Patrol checkpoint was closed? It sounded paranoid, crazy. He'd sound like one of those drivers who saw conspiracies everywhere, who thought every shadow was a threat. Then he saw the convoy. It appeared on the horizon ahead of him, a line of vehicles moving east on 62, maybe 6 or 7 trucks in a row. As Abner got closer, he could see that they were all commercial vehicles, a mix of semis and box trucks, traveling in tight formation with maybe 50 feet between each truck. They all had their headlights on, but no running lights, which was illegal and dangerous. Abner flashed his high beams at the lead truck, a courtesy warning, but the convoy didn't respond. It just kept moving, perfectly spaced, perfectly synchronized. Abner slowed down as the convoy passed him, one truck after another. He tried to read the company names on the doors, but they were either painted over or covered with mud. The trailers had no markings either, just blank white sides that reflected his headlights. He counted 7 trucks total, all of them identical, all of them moving at exactly the same speed. The last truck in line had a white Ford F-250 following behind it, and as it passed Abner, he saw the light bar on the roof, the tinted windows, the government plates. It was the same Ford that had tried to get him to pull over. Abner's blood ran cold. He watched in his mirrors as the convoy disappeared into the darkness behind him, the Ford's taillights the last thing he saw before they vanished completely. He grabbed his CB mic again. "This is Abner Lathrop, eastbound 62 approaching Van Horn. I just passed a convoy of 7 unmarked trucks with a white Ford Escort. Something's not right out here. Anybody listening, please respond." Still nothing. The CB was dead, not even static anymore, just silence. Abner turned it off and focused on the road. His hands were shaking. He told himself to calm down, told himself it was just a coincidence, told himself that there were plenty of legitimate reasons for trucks to travel in convoy, for Border Patrol checkpoints to be closed, for white Fords to have light bars and government plates. But he didn't believe any of it. He reached Van Horn at 2:53 a.m. and followed his GPS to the oil field staging area on the east side of town. The gate was locked, which was expected, and there was a sign with a phone number to call for after-hours delivery. Abner called the number and got a voicemail saying the office would open at 7 a.m. He hung up and looked around. The staging area was a fenced lot with maybe 20 other trucks parked in rows, most of them flatbeds like his, all loaded with drilling equipment. There were lights on poles at each corner of the lot, but half of them were burned out, leaving patches of darkness between the trucks. Abner parked in an open spot near the gate and shut down the engine. He was exhausted, his eyes burning, his back aching from 9 straight hours in the seat. He needed to sleep, needed to log his 10-hour break before he could drive again. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He locked the doors and pulled the curtain across the sleeper compartment, then lay down on the bunk and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come. Every time he started to drift off, he heard sounds, footsteps on gravel, voices in the distance, the rattle of chains. He sat up and looked out the window but saw nothing except the other trucks sitting silent in the darkness. At 6:45 a.m., the staging area office opened, and a man in a hard hat came out to meet Abner. His name was Thane Yarbrough, and he was a DPS inspector assigned to the oil field for safety and compliance checks. He had a clipboard and a tablet, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of dealing with tired drivers and sketchy paperwork. Abner climbed down from the cab and handed over his bill of lading and his logbook. Thane looked at the documents, tapping through screens on his tablet, his face expressionless. "You came through the Pine Springs checkpoint last night?" he asked. "It was closed," Abner said. Thane looked up. "Closed?" "Yeah. Gates were down, nobody on duty. I drove right through." Thane frowned and made a note on his tablet. "That's not supposed to happen. Checkpoint's supposed to be staffed 24/7. He scrolled through more screens, then looked at Abner. "According to the system, you cleared the checkpoint at 12:34 a.m. Got a green light on the inspection." That's impossible, Abner said. I told you it was closed. I didn't stop, didn't get inspected, didn't see anyone. Thane turned the tablet around so Abner could see the screen. There was a photo of his truck, taken from above, showing the Kenworth and the flatbed and the load of drilling equipment. The timestamp said Joe 34, and the location said US 62 Pine Springs Checkpoint. Below the photo was a notation. Inspection Level 1 completed. No violations. Abner stared at the screen. I've never seen that photo before. I didn't stop at that checkpoint. Well, somebody took this photo, Thane said, and somebody logged it into the system, and according to this, you were inspected and cleared. He handed the tablet back to Abner. You're saying this didn't happen? I'm saying the checkpoint was closed when I went through. Dark, empty, nobody there. Thane studied Abner's face for a long moment, then sighed. Look, I don't know what to tell you. The system says you were inspected. If you're claiming you weren't, that's a problem. Could mean your credentials were spoofed, could mean someone's messing with the database. Either way, it's above my pay grade. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Abner. Call this number and file a report. DPS Fraud Division. They'll want to talk to you. Abner took the card and looked at it. The name on it was Thane Yarbrough, DPS Inspector, with a phone number and an email address. What about my load? Abner asked. Can I unload? I need to inspect it first, Thane said. Make sure it matches the manifest. Could take an hour, maybe 2. Abner nodded and stepped aside while Thane climbed onto the flatbed and started checking the load, counting pipe sections, verifying serial numbers on the drill bits, taking photos with his tablet. Abner walked to the office building and asked if he could use the restroom. The woman at the front desk, whose name tag said Maybelline Treadwell, pointed him down a hallway. Abner splashed cold water on his face and stared at himself in the mirror. He looked like hell. Dark circles under his eyes, 2 days of stubble on his jaw, skin pale and drawn. When he came back out, Maybelline was standing near the door, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. You look like you could use this, she said, offering him the cup. Thanks. Abner took the coffee and drank half of it in one gulp. It was hot and bitter and exactly what he needed. Long drive? Maybelline asked. Long night, Abner said. He hesitated, then decided to ask. You ever hear about trucks running in convoy out on 62? Unmarked trucks with escorts? Maybelline's expression changed, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes. I've heard stories, she said carefully. What kind of stories? She glanced back at the office, then lowered her voice. Drivers talk. Some of them say there's a route that runs at night, trucks carrying things that aren't on any manifest, things that don't go through checkpoints. They say if you see the convoy, you're supposed to just keep driving, pretend you didn't see anything. And if you don't? Maybelline shrugged. Nothing good, from what I hear. Drivers getting pulled over for inspections that take hours, loads getting held up, paperwork getting lost. Some guys say their logs get flagged, violations that don't make sense, stuff that shows up in the system but never actually happened. She paused. Kind of like what you were just talking about with Thane. Abner felt his stomach twist. You think someone's targeting me? I think you should be careful, Maybelline said. And I think you should probably not talk to anyone else about what you saw last night. Not until you figure out who's who. Before Abner could respond, Thane came walking back from the flatbed, his face set in a grim expression. We've got a problem, he said. Your load count is off. Manifest says 40 sections of 8-inch pipe, but I'm only counting 38. That's not possible, Abner said. I watched them loaded in Carlsbad. Everything was counted and verified. Well, it's not all here now, Thane said. Which means either someone stole 2 sections between Carlsbad and here, or the load was short when it left. Either way, I can't clear you for unloading until we sort this out. Abner walked back to the flatbed with Thane and counted the pipe sections himself. 38. He recounted. Still 38. He pulled out his copy of the bill of lading and checked the numbers. It clearly said 40 sections. He looked at the chains holding the load in place and saw that they were still tight. No sign of tampering. But there were 2 empty spaces in the stack where pipe sections should have been. Gaps that looked deliberate, like someone had carefully removed specific pieces. "When did you last check this load?" Thane asked. "Yesterday afternoon, when I left Carlsbad," Abner said. "It was all there." "You stop anywhere between Carlsbad and here?" "No. I drove straight through." Abner paused, thinking about the white Ford, the convoy, the closed checkpoint. "Well, I slowed down a few times, for traffic, but I never stopped." Thane made notes on his tablet. "I'm going to need to impound this load until we can get someone from the shipper down here to verify the count. Could be a few days." "A few days?" Abner felt panic rising. "I can't sit here for a few days. I've got other loads, other deliveries." "Not my problem," Thane said. "You signed for 40 sections. You're only delivering 38. That's a discrepancy, and discrepancies don't get ignored. Not in this business." Abner spent the next 3 hours on the phone with his dispatcher, with the shipper in Carlsbad, with the oil field logistics manager. Everyone agreed that the load count was wrong, but nobody could explain how or when the pipe sections had gone missing. The shipper insisted that 40 sections had been loaded and verified. Abner's GPS logs showed he'd driven straight from Carlsbad to Van Horn with no stops except for the brief slowdown on US 62. The oil field manager refused to accept a short load and demanded a full investigation. By noon, Thane had filled out enough paperwork to choke a horse, and Abner was told to park his truck in the impound section of the lot and wait for further instructions. He sat in his cab, staring at nothing, trying to piece together what had happened. The white Ford that had tried to get him to pull over. The convoy of unmarked trucks. The closed checkpoint that somehow had a record of inspecting him. And now 2 missing pipe sections that had disappeared from a chained and secured load. He thought about what Mabeline had said. Trucks carrying things that aren't on any manifest. Things that don't go through checkpoints. He pulled out his phone and called the DPS fraud division number on Thane's card. The woman who answered took his information and told him someone would call him back within 48 hours. 48 hours. Abner hung up and stared at the impound lot through his windshield. That night, lying in his sleeper bunk with the curtains drawn, Abner heard vehicles moving in the lot. He cracked the curtain and saw a white Ford F-250 with a light bar on the roof, cruising slowly between the parked trucks. It stopped near Abner's Kenworth, and 2 figures got out. They walked around his truck, shining flashlights at the tires, the 5th wheel, the load on the flatbed. One of them climbed up onto the trailer and examined the chains, running his hands along the pipe sections as if counting them. The other stood near the cab, looking up at the sleeper window. Abner held his breath, trying to stay perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes, the 2 figures climbed back into the Ford and drove away. Abner waited another 30 minutes before he dared to move. He grabbed his phone and tried to take a photo of the Ford's license plate from memory, but his hands were shaking too badly to type. He gave up and just sat there in the darkness, listening to his own heartbeat. The next morning, Thane showed up with a different story. The shipper in Carlsbad had reviewed their loading dock security footage and confirmed that only 38 pipe sections had been loaded onto Abner's truck. The bill of lading had been incorrect, a clerical error. Abner was cleared to unload and could leave as soon as the oil field crew offloaded the flatbed. No investigation, no impound, no problem. Abner didn't believe a word of it. He'd watched them load those pipes himself, had counted them as they went onto the trailer. There had been 40 sections, he was sure of it. But he also knew that arguing would get him nowhere. He signed the paperwork, waited for the unloading to finish, and got back on the road as quickly as he could. He never took another load through West Texas. He told his dispatcher he was done with border routes, done with the Chihuahuan, done with anything east of El Paso. When pressed for a reason, he said he didn't like the wind. It was a lie. But it was easier than explaining what he'd seen, what he'd felt. The certainty that he'd been pulled into something he didn't understand and barely escaped. 6 months later, he heard from another driver that Thane Yarbrough had been fired from DPS for falsifying inspection records. The details were vague. Something about logging inspections that never happened. Something about photographs that didn't match the actual vehicles. Abner tried to find more information but hit dead ends everywhere he looked. Thane's phone number was disconnected. The DPS fraud division claimed they had no record of his call, and the oil field staging area in Van Horn had been shut down for restructuring. Mabeline Treadwell's name didn't appear in any public records. Abner drove back to Van Horn once, 6 months after the incident, just to see if he could find her, talk to her, ask her what she knew. The truck stop where she'd worked was still there, but when he asked about her, the woman at the counter said she'd never heard of anyone by that name. Abner showed her a photo he'd found online from the oil field's website, a staff directory that had since been taken down. The woman looked at it and shook her head. "That's not Mabeline Treadwell," she said. "That's Susan from accounting. She hasn't worked here in over a year." Abner left Van Horn and never went back. He still drives, still hauls freight across the Southwest, but he plans his routes carefully now. He avoids border crossings, avoids checkpoints that seem too quiet, avoids convoys of unmarked trucks. He keeps his CB on at all times and listens to the chatter, listening for warnings, listening for patterns. And sometimes, late at night when he's driving through empty stretches of desert, he sees lights in his mirrors. White Ford F-250s with light bars on their roofs, following at a distance, never getting too close, never falling too far behind. They never pull him over, never try to make contact. They just follow. And Abner knows that whatever he saw that night on US 62, whatever operation he accidentally witnessed, it's still out there. Still running. Still watching. He thinks about the 2 missing pipe sections sometimes, wonders where they went, wonders what they were really for. He thinks about the photograph in the DPS system, the inspection that never happened, the checkpoint that was closed but somehow wasn't. He thinks about Thane Yarbrough and Mabeline Treadwell, if those were even their real names, and what role they played in whatever was happening out there in the Chihuahua night. Mostly, though, he thinks about the convoy. 7 trucks traveling in perfect formation. No markings, no lights, moving through the desert like ghosts. He wonders where they were going, what they were carrying, who was running them. And he wonders how many other drivers have seen what he saw, how many have had their loads tampered with, their logs altered, their memories questioned. He'll never know the answers. And somewhere deep down, in a place he doesn't like to examine too closely, he's grateful for that. Because the alternative, learning the truth, understanding what he'd stumbled into, might be worse than the uncertainty. Might be the kind of knowledge that makes you a liability instead of just a witness. The kind of knowledge that turns white Fords from shadows in your mirrors into something much more dangerous. So Abner drives his routes, keeps his head down, and doesn't ask questions. And when other drivers talk about strange things they've seen on the border highways, about convoys and checkpoints and inspections that don't make sense, he nods along and says nothing, because in the end, the desert keeps its secrets. And the smart drivers, the ones who want to keep driving, learn to keep those secrets too. The wind hit Hobart Keene's trailer like a freight train at 2:17 a.m., and for one terrifying moment he thought the whole rig was going over. The Peterbilt 389 lurched sideways, tires screaming, and Hobart felt the fifth wheel trying to break loose as the trailer pushed against the tractor. He eased off the throttle and fought the wheel, keeping his movements small and controlled, fighting every instinct that told him to jerk the truck back into line. Overcorrecting in a crosswind was how jackknifes happened, and out here on Utah's I-80 west of the Bonneville Salt Flats, a jackknife would mean lying in a ditch until sunrise, waiting for a wrecker that might take hours to arrive. Hobart had been through this section of highway 100 times, usually during the day when you could see the wind coming. Watch it tear across the white expanse of the salt flats like ripples on water. But at night, in February, with temperatures below freezing and wind gusts hitting 50 miles an hour, the flats became something else entirely. They became a wind tunnel, a corridor where air compressed and accelerated, funneling between mountain ranges with nowhere to go except straight across the highway. Trucks got blown over out here regularly, especially empty trailers or high-sided dry vans, and even a loaded rig could get pushed around if the wind hit just right. Hobart was pulling a 53-foot dry van loaded with electronics, computer components coming out of Salt Lake City and heading to Reno. The load was heavy, 42,000 pounds, which should have been enough to keep him stable, but the trailer had a high profile and the wind was finding every square inch of it. He could feel the tug every few seconds, that sideways shove that made his stomach clench, that made him grip the wheel just a little tighter. The CB crackled with warnings from other drivers. Westbound I-80 at mile 28, wind's bad, real bad. Almost lost it coming past the rest area. Be careful out there. Hobart keyed his mic. Appreciate the heads up. I'm at mile 32 feeling it. Gonna slow down and see if I can ride it out. He brought his speed down from 65 to 50, watching his mirrors, watching the way the trailers swayed behind him. The tandems were tracking properly, the load wasn't shifting, but that didn't mean he was safe. One good gust at the wrong angle and physics would take over. The trailer would swing out, the fifth wheel would break loose, and he'd be sliding sideways across the interstate with 30 tons of momentum carrying him wherever it wanted to go. The lights of Wendover appeared in the distance, a small cluster of casinos and truck stops that straddled the Utah-Nevada border. Hobart aimed for them like a drowning man aiming for shore, willing the rig to stay straight, willing the wind to ease up. He was maybe 5 miles from the first exit when the gust hit. It came from the north, perpendicular to the highway, and it caught the trailer broadside. Hobart felt the rear end of the trailer start to slide, felt the tractor losing traction, felt the whole rig beginning the slow, inevitable rotation that would end with him jackknifed across both lanes. He did everything right. He didn't hit the brakes, didn't try to power through it, just eased off the throttle and let the truck's weight and the trailer's momentum balance each other out. For a moment, it seemed like it might work, like the physics would resolve in his favor and the rig would straighten out. Then the trailer's rear tandems hit a patch of black ice, invisible in the darkness, and the rotation accelerated. The trailer swung out at a 45-degree angle, then 60, then 90, and Hobart felt the sickening sideways slide of a jackknife into progress. He rode it out, hands on the wheel, watching through the mirrors as the trailer came around. The rig slid across the right lane, across the shoulder, and came to rest at the edge of the highway with the trailer blocking both lanes and the tractor pointed into the ditch. The engine was still running, the air brakes hissing, but the truck wasn't moving. Hobart sat there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to calm his racing heart. He'd jackknifed. After 19 years of driving trucks, after all the training and experience and careful route planning, he'd finally done it. He climbed down from the cab and walked around the rig, assessing the damage. The trailer was sitting perpendicular to the highway, blocking both lanes completely. The tandems had slid off the pavement and were resting in the dirt shoulder, but nothing looked broken or bent. The fifth wheel was still connected, the kingpin was secure, and the trailer doors were intact. If he could just get the rig straightened out, if he could get the tandems back on the pavement, he might be able to drive out of this without needing a wrecker. But that was a big if. The trailer weighed 75,000 pounds fully loaded, and moving it without damaging the fifth wheel or bending the frame required precision and care. Hobart pulled out his phone and checked for signal. 1 bar. He called his dispatcher and explained the situation, gave his GPS coordinates, and asked about getting a wrecker sent out. The dispatcher said it would be at least 2 hours, maybe 3. The wind had caused multiple accidents and all the local wrecker services were tied up. 2 hours? Hobart said. I'm blocking both lanes. Someone's going to hit me. Put out your triangles, the dispatcher said, and turn on your hazards. I'll get someone there as fast as I can. Hobart hung up and pulled his emergency triangles out of the side box. He walked back down the highway, placing them at intervals, bright, reflective pyramids that warned approaching traffic. The wind kept trying to knock them over, and twice he had to reset them, weighting them down with rocks. When he got back to the truck, he saw headlights approaching from the east, a vehicle moving slowly, cautiously. It pulled up alongside the jackknifed rig and stopped, and a man climbed out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and work gloves with a wool cap pulled low over his ears. His face was weathered and lined, the kind of face that came from years of working outdoors, and his eyes were sharp and assessing. He looked at the jackknifed trailer, then at Hobart. "Hell of a spot you're in," the man said. His voice was rough, gravelly. "Wind got me," Hobart said. "I've got a wrecker coming, but it's going to be a couple of hours." The man nodded. "You're lucky you didn't roll it. I've seen trucks end up on their sides out here." He walked around the rig, examining the angle, the position of the tandems, the way the trailer was sitting. "You know, I could probably help you get this straightened out. Save you the wrecker fee." Hobart hesitated. Wrecker fees were expensive, sometimes $1,000 or more for a recovery like this, and that would come out of his settlement if the insurance didn't cover it. But he also knew that trying to move a jackknifed trailer without proper equipment was risky. One wrong move, and you could damage the fifth wheel, crack the frame, or make the situation worse. "How would you do it?" Hobart asked. The man pointed at his vehicle, a heavy-duty pickup truck with a winch mounted on the front bumper. "I've got a 12,000-pound winch and 60 feet of cable. We hook the cable to your trailer's rear frame rail, then I pull while you drive forward. Straightens the trailer out, gets your tandems back on the pavement. Done it before, dozens of times. Drivers out here get in trouble, I help them out." "You do this professionally?" "I'm a good Samaritan," the man said, smiling. "But I don't work for free. $200 cash and I'll have you back on the road in 20 minutes. Hobart did the math in his head. $200 versus $1,000 for a wrecker, plus the time savings, plus not having to report the incident to his insurance. It seemed like a good deal, maybe too good. But he was desperate. He looked at the trailer blocking the highway, thought about the potential for another vehicle coming around the curve and slamming into him, thought about the hours he'd lose waiting for a wrecker. "All right," Hobart said. "Let's do it." The man's smile widened. "Smart choice. Name's Orson Braddock, by the way." Hobart keen. They shook hands, and Orson walked back to his truck. He maneuvered it into position near the rear of the trailer, then got out and started unspooling the winch cable. Hobart watched as Orson secured the cable to the trailer's frame rail, wrapping it around a crossmember and hooking it back onto itself. The setup looked professional enough, and Orson moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "All right," Orson called out. "Get in your cab and put it in first gear, low range. When I give you the signal, you drive forward slow and steady. I'll be pulling from back here, and the trailer should straighten out. Keep your wheels straight, don't try to steer, just let the truck do its thing." Hobart climbed into the cab and started the engine. He put the transmission in first gear, low range, and waited for Orson's signal. Through the mirror, he could see Orson standing near his truck, hand raised. Then the hand dropped, and Hobart heard the winch start to whine. He eased off the clutch and felt the Peterbilt start to roll forward, felt the tension in the fifth wheel as the trailer began to move. For the first few seconds, everything seemed to be working. The trailer was rotating, the angle decreasing, the tandem starting to slide back toward the pavement. Then Hobart felt something wrong. A shudder in the fifth wheel, a grinding sound that shouldn't be there. He stopped immediately, set the brake, and climbed down. The fifth wheel was still connected, but the jaws looked bent, and there was fresh grease on the ground underneath. Hobart's stomach sank. He walked back to where Orson was standing. "Something's wrong with the fifth wheel. I think we damaged it." Orson crouched down and examined the fifth wheel, running his fingers along the jaws. "Yeah, looks like the kingpin slipped a little. Put some stress on the locking mechanism. Probably weakened it when you jackknifed." He stood up and brushed off his hands. "We can keep going, but you're going to need to get that fifth wheel inspected before you drive too far. Could be a safety issue." Hobart felt anger rising in his chest. "You said you'd done this before. You said it was safe." "It is safe," Orson said calmly. "For the trailer. Fifth wheel damage is just one of those things that happens sometimes. Not my fault your equipment was already compromised." "My equipment was fine before you started pulling." Orson's expression hardened. "You want to argue about it, or you want to get your truck off the highway before someone hits it?" Hobart swallowed his anger. Orson was right. They needed to finish this. "Fine, let's keep going." They made 2 more attempts, and each time Hobart felt the fifth wheel grinding and shuddering. On the 3rd attempt, the trailer finally straightened out and the tandems rolled back onto the pavement. But by then, Hobart knew the damage was done. The fifth wheel was compromised, the jaws weren't seating properly, and driving the truck in this condition was dangerous. Orson unhooked the winch cable and rolled it back onto the spool. "There you go. Back on the road. That'll be $200. Hobart pulled out his wallet and counted out $200 in cash. He handed it to Orson, who pocketed it without counting. "You should probably get that fifth wheel looked at before you drive too far," Orson said. "There's a repair shop in Wendover, about 5 miles up the road. They open at 6 a.m. "Thanks for the advice," Hobart said, his tone bitter. Orson climbed into his truck and drove off, tail lights disappearing into the darkness. Hobart stood there for a moment, looking at his rig, at the bent fifth wheel jaws, at the grease on the ground. He'd been played, he realized. Orson had known exactly what would happen, had probably damaged the fifth wheel deliberately, and now Hobart was stuck with a repair bill on top of the $200 he'd just paid. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, felt the shudder in the fifth wheel as he pulled forward. The trailer was tracking behind him, but it felt loose, unstable. He brought his speed down to 30 miles an hour and nursed the rig toward Wendover, every bump in the road sending vibrations through the frame, every gust of wind making the trailer sway more than it should. He made it to the Wendover truck stop just as the sun was coming up. pulled into the repair bay and explained the situation to the mechanic on duty. The mechanic, a young guy with a clipboard and a skeptical expression, climbed under the trailer and inspected the fifth wheel. When he came back out, his expression had shifted from skeptical to concerned. "This isn't just bent jaws," the mechanic said. "The whole locking mechanism is damaged. Somebody put lateral stress on it, probably tried to pull the trailer sideways while it was still connected. You're lucky the kingpin didn't shear off completely. If that had happened while you were driving, the trailer would have separated from the tractor." Hobart felt cold dread wash over him. "How much to fix it?" "I'll have to order parts. Could be a couple days. And we're talking $1,500, maybe $2,000, depending on what else we find when we get in there." $2,000? The mechanic shrugged. "Fifth wheel replacements aren't cheap. And you can't drive this truck until it's fixed. Diot would pull you off the road in a heartbeat if they saw this." Hobart spent the next hour on the phone with his dispatcher, with his insurance company, with the mechanic, trying to figure out how to handle this. The insurance company said they'd cover the repair, but he'd have to pay the deductible, which was $1,000. The dispatcher said the load would have to be transferred to another truck, which meant Hobart would lose the revenue from this haul, and the mechanic said the parts wouldn't arrive until Monday, which was 3 days away. By mid-morning, Hobart was sitting in the truck stop diner, drinking bad coffee and trying to process what had happened. He'd been scammed, plain and simple. Orson Braddock, if that was even his real name, had seen an opportunity and exploited it, damaged the fifth wheel deliberately, and walked away with $200 in cash. And now Hobart was stuck in Wendover with a broken truck and mounting bills. He pulled out his phone and called the local sheriff's office, explained what had happened, described Orson and his truck. The deputy who took the report sounded sympathetic but not optimistic. "We get reports like this pretty regularly," the deputy said. "Guy with a winch truck offers to help drivers who are in trouble, then either damages their equipment or charges way more than he quoted. Problem is, it's hard to prove. He'll say you agreed to the price, you'll say he damaged your truck, and without video evidence, it's just he said she said. So you're not going to do anything?" "I'll file the report," the deputy said. "And I'll keep an eye out for his truck, but I can't make any promises." Hobart hung up and stared at his coffee. He thought about calling the state patrol, filing a complaint with the Utah Highway Patrol, but he suspected he'd get the same response. Without proof, without witnesses, it was just his word against Orson's. He spent the next 3 days in Wendover, waiting for the parts, watching his savings dwindle as he paid for meals and a motel room. The mechanic installed the new fifth wheel on Monday afternoon, and by Tuesday morning, Hobart was back on the road, empty trailer heading back to Salt Lake City. He'd lost a week of work, lost the revenue from the load, and was out nearly $3,000 between the deductible, the $200 he'd paid Orson, and the motel and food expenses. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the feeling of being played, of being targeted and manipulated by someone who knew exactly how desperate and vulnerable he'd been. Orson had seen a driver in trouble and had seen an opportunity to profit, and Hobart had walked right into it. A month later, Hobart was rolling through Utah again, this time on a different route, I-15 north of Nephi. He stopped at a rest area to use the bathroom and check his load, and while he was walking back to his truck, he saw a white pickup with a winch on the front bumper parked near the exit. The driver was standing next to it, talking to another trucker, gesturing at a rig that was parked at an odd angle near the shoulder. Hobart walked over, close enough to hear the conversation. The truck driver was explaining that he'd blown a steer tire and had pulled off to change it, but the lug nuts were seized and he couldn't get them off. The man with the winch truck was offering to help, said he had an impact wrench in his truck, could get the lugs off in 5 minutes. "I don't usually charge for something this simple," the man was saying, "but I've got to cover my fuel costs. How about $50? Hobart got close enough to see the man's face. It wasn't Orson Braddock. The features were different. The build was wrong, but there was something about the setup that felt familiar. The helpful stranger, the truck in distress, the offer of assistance that seemed too convenient. He walked up to the truck driver and pulled him aside. "Don't pay him," Hobart said quietly. The truck driver looked confused. "What?" "I'm telling you, don't pay him, and don't let him touch your truck. Just call for roadside assistance, wait for a legitimate service." "Why? What's wrong with him?" Hobart looked back at the man with the winch truck, who was now watching them with a neutral expression. "Just trust me," Hobart said. "I've been down this road before." The truck driver seemed to consider this, then nodded. "All right, thanks for the heads up." He walked back to the man with the winch truck and told him he'd changed his mind, that he was going to call his own service. The man shrugged, climbed into his truck, and drove away without argument. The truck driver walked back to Hobart. "You think that guy was running a scam? I think you saved yourself a lot of money and headache," Hobart said. They talked for a few minutes, and Hobart told him about his experience with Orson Braddock, about the damaged fifth wheel, about the $3,000 he'd lost. The truck driver listened, shaking his head. "I've heard stories like that," he said. "Guys who target truckers, pretend to help, then either damage equipment or charge way more than they quoted. Never thought I'd run into one myself." "They're out there," Hobart said. "Especially in places like this, rest areas, truck stops, anywhere drivers might be vulnerable. Best thing you can do is be careful who you trust." Hobart climbed back into his truck and got back on the road. He thought about Orson Braddock. Wondered if he was still out there, still running his scam on desperate drivers. He thought about the man with the winch truck at the rest area. Wondered if he was part of the same operation or just an opportunist working his own angle. And he thought about all the drivers out there who didn't know, who hadn't been warned, who would make the same mistake he'd made. He still drives I-80 through Utah, still passes the spot where he jackknifed that February night. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing hard across the salt flats, he sees trucks pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and he wonders if they're in real trouble or if someone like Orson is already there, offering help that isn't help at all. He never stops to find out. He just keeps driving, eyes forward, hands on the wheel, and he tries not to think about how easy it was to become a victim, how quickly trust can turn into exploitation, how the desert highways are full of people who make their living off other people's misfortune. And sometimes, when he's checking into a way station or stopping at a scale house, he sees familiar faces, people who smile and nod and seem to know more than they should, people who ask about his fifth wheel, about that night in Wendover, about how much the repairs cost. And Hobart wonders if the scam goes deeper than he thought, if there are people in the system itself who are part of it, who feed information to the Orsons of the world, who help identify targets and create opportunities. He doesn't know. He'll probably never know. But he drives more carefully now, trusts less easily, and always calls for legitimate roadside assistance when something goes wrong. Because in the end, the $200 he paid Orson Braddock wasn't just payment for a service. It was tuition for a lesson he'll never forget. Boaz. Kincaid pulled into the tow yard at 11:43 p.m. with a blown transmission and a growing sense that this night was going to get worse before it got better. The yard was on the outskirts of Carlsbad, New Mexico, 30 miles from the Texas border, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A hand-painted sign near the gate said Kincannon Recovery and Impound, and below that, In smaller letters, 24-hour service. The gate was open, which Boaz took as a good sign, but the yard itself looked like something out of a nightmare. Dozens of trucks parked in crooked rows, most of them missing wheels or doors or entire engines, all of them covered in a thick layer of desert dust that made them look like they'd been sitting there for years. Boaz had been limping along US 285 when the transmission finally gave out, grinding and whining and then just stopping, leaving him coasting on momentum alone. He'd managed to get off the highway and onto a side road before the truck died completely, and he'd called the number on the sign for the nearest tow service. The dispatcher had told him it would be 90 minutes before they could send a truck, and Boaz had spent that time sitting in his cab, watching his ELD clock tick down, watching his delivery window evaporate, watching his settlement shrink with every passing minute. The wrecker that finally showed up was an old Peterbilt 379 with a boom that looked like it had been welded together from scrap metal. The driver was a thin man in his 50s with greasy hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He'd hooked up Boaz's Freightliner without saying much, just grunted instructions about where to sit and how to secure the load, and then they'd driven in silence to the tow yard. Now Boaz was standing in the yard office, a cramped room with water-stained ceiling tiles and a desk covered in paper, talking to the yard manager. His name was Jericho Sloan, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from old leather and left in the sun too long. He was going through Boaz's paperwork with a methodical slowness that suggested he had all the time in the world, and Boaz had none. "Transmission's shot," Jericho said, not looking up from the papers. "Gonna need a rebuild or a replacement. Could take a week, maybe 2, depending on parts availability." 2 weeks? Boaz felt his stomach drop. "I can't wait 2 weeks. I've got loads lined up, deliveries scheduled." Jericho shrugged. "Not my problem. I can expedite it for an extra fee, but that'll run you another $1,000 on top of the repair costs." Boaz did the math in his head. The transmission rebuild would be at least $5,000. The tow was another $500, and now Jericho was asking for $1,000 more just to move him up the queue. It was extortion, plain and simple, but Boaz didn't have a choice. Without his truck, he couldn't work, and without work, he couldn't pay his bills. "Fine," Boaz said, "do it." Jericho made a note on a clipboard, then handed Boaz a form to sign. "You'll need to leave the truck here until the work's done. We'll call you when it's ready." Boaz scanned the form. It was a standard tow yard release, giving Jericho's operation permission to work on the truck and hold it until payment was received. He signed it and handed it back. "Can I get my personal stuff out of the cab?" "Not tonight," Jericho said. "Yard's locked down after midnight. Insurance policy. You can come back tomorrow during business hours." "Tomorrow? I need my wallet, my phone charger, my clothes. Should have thought of that before you signed the form." Jericho's tone was flat, bored. "Yard opens at 8 a.m. You can get your stuff then." Boaz felt anger rising but forced it down. Getting into an argument with the yard manager wasn't going to help. He asked about a place to stay, and Jericho pointed him toward a motel 2 miles down the road. "Tell him Jericho sent you. They'll give you a discount." Boaz walked out of the office and into the yard. The night air was cold and dry, and the wind was kicking up dust devils between the rows of trucks. He stopped and looked around, trying to get his bearings. The yard was bigger than he'd first thought, stretching back into the darkness, with trucks parked in irregular clusters that seemed to follow no discernible pattern. Some had tarps thrown over them, others were stripped down to bare frames, and a few looked like they were in good condition, like they'd just been parked there yesterday. He started walking toward the gate, but halfway there he heard a sound that made him stop. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the yard, a rhythmic clanging like metal striking metal. He turned and looked but couldn't see anything except shadows and dust. The sound continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. Boaz stood there listening, but all he heard was the wind. He kept walking. The gate was ahead of him, a gap in the chain-link fence illuminated by a single overhead light. As he approached, he saw a figure standing near the entrance, partially hidden in shadow. Boaz slowed, uncertain, then recognized the uniform of a fuel station attendant. The figure stepped into the light and Boaz saw it was a woman, maybe 40 years old with short dark hair and tired eyes. "You need a ride?" she asked. Her voice was rough, like she'd been smoking for years. "I was going to call a cab," Boaz said. "Cabs don't come out here this late. I'm heading into town. I can give you a lift. I'm Avis Pennington. I work at the fuel island up the road." Boaz hesitated. He didn't know this woman, didn't know if he could trust her, but he also didn't have many options. The motel was 2 miles away, and walking in the dark on a desert highway didn't appeal to him. "All right," he said. "Thanks." They walked to Avis's car, an old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a duct-taped bumper. She drove carefully, keeping her speed low, and they made small talk about the weather and the town and the tow yard. Boaz asked how long Jericho had been running the place, and Avis said she wasn't sure. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. "He's not the friendliest guy," she said, "but he gets the job done." She dropped Boaz at the motel and refused his offer of gas money. "Just be careful out there," she said. "Carlsbad's not a bad town, but the yards can be tricky. Lots of paperwork, lots of fees. Make sure you keep copies of everything." Boaz thanked her and checked into the motel. The room was small and smelled like mildew, but the bed was clean and the TV worked. He tried to sleep but couldn't, his mind racing with worries about the truck, the repair costs, the lost income. Around 3 a.m. he finally drifted off, and when he woke up it was almost noon. He showered and dressed, then called a cab to take him back to the tow yard. The gate was open, and there were a few people moving around, mechanics working on trucks, a forklift moving pallets. Boaz walked to the office and found Jericho sitting at the same desk, going through the same papers. "I'm here to get my personal items," Boaz said. Jericho looked up, his expression blank. "From which truck?" "My truck, the Freightliner you towed in last night." Jericho flipped through a stack of papers on his desk, then shook his head. "Don't have a record of a Freightliner coming in last night." Boaz felt a spike of panic. "What do you mean you don't have a record? Your driver towed it. You took my paperwork. I signed a release form." "Let me check the log." Jericho turned to a computer and started typing. After a moment, he looked back at Boaz. "Nothing here. What's your truck number?" Boaz gave him the unit number and Jericho typed it in. More waiting, more clicking. Then Jericho frowned. "According to this, that unit number came through our yard 3 weeks ago. Owner paid the storage fees and picked it up." "That's impossible," Boaz said, his voice rising. "I drove that truck yesterday. It's sitting in your yard right now. I'm telling you what the system says." Jericho's tone was calm, almost amused. "Maybe you got the unit number wrong." Boaz pulled out his phone and showed Jericho a photo of his truck, the unit number clearly visible on the door. "That's my truck, that's the number. Now tell me where it is." Jericho studied the photo, then stood up. "All right, let's go take a look." They walked out into the yard, Boaz following Jericho through the rows of parked trucks. Boaz tried to remember where the wrecker had left his Freightliner, tried to orient himself using landmarks, but everything looked different in the daylight. The rows that had seemed random in the darkness now looked deliberate, organized by truck type or size or some other criterion he couldn't discern. After 10 minutes of walking, Jericho stopped and pointed at a white Freightliner Cascadia parked near the back fence. "That your truck?" Boaz walked over and checked the unit number on the door. It was close to his number, but off by 2 digits. No, that's not mine. Mine ends in 47, not 74. Jericho made a note on his clipboard. Maybe your truck got moved. Let me check the other sections. They spent the next half hour walking through the yard, checking every Freightliner they could find, but none of them matched Boaz's unit number. Boaz was starting to panic now, his mind spinning through scenarios. Had the truck been stolen? Had it been towed to a different yard by mistake? Had Jericho's system been hacked, the records altered? "I'm telling you, your truck's not here," Jericho said finally. "Either it never came in, or it came in and left. Check your paperwork, check your records. Maybe you got confused about which yard you were at." "I'm not confused," Boaz said, his voice tight with frustration. "Your driver towed my truck here last night. I watched him do it. I signed papers in your office. And now you're telling me it doesn't exist?" Jericho's expression hardened. "I'm telling you what the records show. And if you want to keep arguing about it, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Boaz stood there, staring at Jericho, trying to understand what was happening. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. He'd been here, in this yard, 12 hours ago. He'd talked to this man, signed forms, made arrangements for repairs. And now, it was like it had never happened. He walked back to the office and asked to see the release form he'd signed. Jericho pulled out a file and flipped through it, then shook his head. "No release form with your name on it." "I signed it right here," Boaz said, pointing at the desk. "You handed it to me, I signed it, I gave it back. Then, it should be in the file, and it's not." Jericho closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you were at a different yard. Maybe you dreamed it. But as far as my records show, you've never been here." Boaz felt like he was losing his mind. He pulled out his phone and checked his call history, looking for the number he'd dialed to request the tow. It wasn't there. He checked his text messages, his emails, his banking app. Nothing. No record of paying for a tow, no confirmation number, no communication with Jericho's yard. He walked out of the office in a daze and stood in the yard looking around. Everything looked the same as it had last night. The same rows of trucks, the same razor wire on the fence, the same dusty ground. But something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it, couldn't articulate what it was, but there was a wrongness to the place that made his skin crawl. He started walking through the yard again, this time on his own, searching methodically. He checked every Freightliner, every truck that was even close to his model and year. He looked at unit numbers, at license plates, at company logos. Nothing matched. His truck wasn't here. Then, in the far corner of the yard, near a cluster of stripped-down semis, he found something that made him stop. It was a stack of papers, held down by a rock, sitting on the hood of a wrecked trailer. He picked up the papers and flipped through them. They were violation reports, printed on official-looking forms with the New Mexico Department of Transportation logo at the top. He scanned the first page, and his blood went cold. The report was for a white Freightliner Cascadia with his unit number, his license plate, his name as the registered owner. The violation was listed as overweight at scale, falsified logbook, expired medical certificate. The date was 3 days ago. The location was listed as a way station on I-40 near Tucumcari, 200 miles north of here. Boaz had never been to Tucumcari. He'd never been pulled over at that way station. His medical certificate was current, his logs were clean, and he'd never hauled an overweight load in his life. This report was fake. It had to be. But it looked real, down to the signature of the officer who'd allegedly written it, down to the case number and the fine amount. He kept flipping through the stack. There were more reports, all of them for his truck, all of them listing violations he'd never committed. Running a red light in Roswell, failure to secure load in Hobbs, improper lane change in Artesia. Each report had dates, times, locations, officer signatures. Each one looked legitimate. Boaz heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Jericho walking toward him, flanked by 2 other men. They were big guys, wearing work clothes and hard expressions, and they didn't look friendly. "You need to leave," Jericho said. His voice was cold now, no longer bored or amused. "You're trespassing." "I found these," Boaz said, holding up the papers. "These are violation reports for my truck, reports that are fake. What the hell is going on here?" Jericho glanced at the papers, then at the 2 men beside him. "I don't know what you're talking about. Those aren't mine, and I'm asking you to leave now before I call the police." "Call them," Boaz said. "I want to report a crime. Someone's been filing fake violation reports using my truck's information. If you don't leave right now, I'm going to have my guys escort you out, and it won't be pleasant." The 2 men stepped forward, and Boaz realized he didn't have a choice. He folded the papers and stuffed them in his pocket, then walked toward the gate. The men followed him, staying a few paces behind, making sure he left. At the gate, Boaz turned back and looked at Jericho. "I'm going to the police," Boaz said. "I'm going to report all of this. The missing truck, the fake reports, everything." "Good luck with that," Jericho said. And then he smiled, a cold, humorless smile that made Boaz's stomach turn. Boaz walked down the road toward the town, pulling out his phone as he went. He called 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher, told her about the missing truck, the fake violation reports, the tow yard that seemed to have no record of him ever being there. The dispatcher took his information and told him an officer would meet him at the station. He spent the next 2 hours at the Carlsbad Police Department, going through his story with a detective named Ramirez. The detective listened patiently, took notes, asked questions. But as Boaz talked, he could see the skepticism growing in the detective's eyes. The detective pulled up Boaz's driver record and found no violations, pulled up his truck registration and found no liens or holds, called Jericho's tow yard, and was told that no truck matching Boaz's description had been towed there in the past month. "I understand this is frustrating," Detective Ramirez said. "But without any physical evidence, without any documentation, there's not much I can do. You're saying your truck was towed, but you don't have a receipt. You're saying you signed papers, but you can't produce them. You're saying there are fake violation reports, but the reports you showed me aren't in any official database." "Because they're fake," Boaz said. "That's the point. Someone's creating false records trying to make it look like I'm a bad driver, trying to get me off the road. Why would someone do that? I don't know. Maybe they want my truck. Maybe they're targeting owner-operators. Maybe—" Boaz stopped. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know why this was happening, didn't know who was behind it, didn't know anything except that his truck was missing and no one believed him. Detective Ramirez gave him a case number and told him to keep checking with local tow yards, to file a stolen vehicle report if the truck didn't turn up in the next 24 hours. Boaz left the police station feeling defeated, exhausted, and more confused than ever. He went back to the motel and tried to think. His truck was gone, his paperwork had vanished, and the only evidence he had were the fake violation reports he'd found in the tow yard. He pulled them out and examined them more closely. The forms looked official, the signatures looked real, but there were small inconsistencies. Wrong fonts, misaligned logos, dates that didn't quite line up with the days of the week. They were good forgeries, but they were forgeries. He called his insurance company and filed a claim for the missing truck. The adjuster took his information and said it would take several days to process. He called his dispatcher and explained what had happened. The dispatcher sounded sympathetic but skeptical, said he'd put Boaz's account on hold until the situation was resolved. That night, lying in the motel bed, Boaz thought about Jericho Sloan and the tow yard. He thought about the rows of abandoned trucks, the mechanics who seemed to be working but were never quite visible, the paperwork that existed one moment and disappeared the next. He thought about Avis Pennington, the fuel station attendant who'd given him a ride, who'd warned him to be careful, to keep copies of everything. He pulled out his phone and searched for Avis Pennington's name. No results. He searched for the fuel station she'd mentioned, the one up the road from the tow yard. No results. He called the number for Kincannon Recovery and Impound and got a message saying the number was no longer in service. Boaz sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He pulled up a map on his phone and looked for the tow yard, tried to find the address. The satellite view showed an empty lot surrounded by chain-link fence. No trucks, no buildings, just dirt and scrub brush. He zoomed in, checking the image date. The photo was from 6 months ago. He got dressed and called another cab, gave the driver the address of the tow yard. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to the location, and Boaz's world tilted. The lot was there, the fence was there, but the gate was gone. The sign was gone. And inside the fence, there were no trucks. Just empty ground, tire tracks in the dust, and a single trailer sitting in the center like a monument to something that used to exist but didn't anymore. Boaz got out of the cab and walked to the fence. He looked through the chain link, scanning for any sign of his truck, any sign that the yard had existed. Nothing. He walked along the perimeter, checking for an entrance, but the gate was welded shut and there was no way in without cutting the fence. He pulled out his phone and took photos, documented everything he could see. Then he got back in the cab and asked the driver if he knew anything about the tow yard. The driver shook his head. Place has been closed for years. Owner went bankrupt, property got seized, nobody uses it anymore. But I was here last night, Boaz said. There were trucks, mechanics, an office. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror, his expression somewhere between pity and concern. You sure about that? Boaz didn't answer. He wasn't sure about anything anymore. He spent the next week in Carlsbad, searching for his truck, filing reports, talking to anyone who would listen. He contacted the New Mexico DOT and asked about violation reports filed in his name. They had no record of any. He contacted local truck repair shops and tow services, asking if anyone had seen a white Freightliner Cascadia with his unit number. No one had. He even hired a private investigator who spent 3 days following leads and came back with nothing. His truck was gone, and with it, his livelihood, his savings, his future. The insurance claim was denied on the grounds that there was no evidence the truck had ever been stolen. The police closed the case due to lack of evidence, and Jericho Sloan, Avis Pennington, and the tow yard called Kincannon Recovery and Impound all ceased to exist, if they'd ever existed at all. Boaz eventually gave up and went home to Oklahoma. He tried to rebuild, tried to get another truck, but the fake violation reports kept surfacing. They'd show up in background checks, in credit reports, in DOT databases. Every time he thought he'd cleared them, they'd appear somewhere else, like ghosts in the system haunting him. He never found out what happened, never learned why he'd been targeted, who was behind it, or where his truck ended up. But sometimes, late at night, he'd drive past tow yards and wonder if other drivers had been through the same thing. Wonder if there were more yards like Kincannon, more operators like Jericho, more fake records floating through databases, destroying careers and lives. And he'd think about that night, about walking through the yard in the darkness, about the rows of abandoned trucks that might not have been abandoned at all, about the papers he'd found, the violations that didn't exist, the system that seemed designed to swallow trucks and drivers and spit out nothing but confusion and loss. He never went back to Carlsbad, never drove US 285 again. And when other drivers asked him why, he'd just say the desert plays tricks on you, makes you see things that aren't there, makes you believe in yards that don't exist and violations that never happened. And most of the time, they'd nod and change the subject, because every trucker knows there are places on the road where the rules don't apply, where reality bends, where you can lose more than just time or money. You can lose yourself. And Boaz Kincaid learned that lesson in a tow yard that wasn't there, talking to people who didn't exist, signing papers that vanished the moment the ink dried. And the worst part was knowing that somewhere out there, his truck was still running, still hauling loads, still showing up in databases and logs and records. But the name on the registration wasn't his anymore. And whoever was driving it now, whoever had taken it, they were invisible, untouchable. Ghosts in a system that ate the living and left no trace behind.